The marble corridors of the imperial palace echoed with a sound that was not battle, not music, but something more terrifying. The muffled cries of a boy. His guards did not dare meet his eyes. He was the Emperor of Rome, and yet tonight he was nothing more than a prisoner. This was not a rumor. It was recorded by chroniclers with trembling hands. A mother castrating her son to keep her throne. Before we descend into the darkest chambers of imperial history, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from. By the end of this story, you'll ask yourself, how far would a ruler go to keep the crown? And what price would a son pay for his mother's ambition? The Empress's name was Irene of Athens, one of the most remarkable and most ruthless women ever to wear the imperial diadem of Rome. Though she lived in the 8th century, when Rome had transformed into the Byzantine Empire, her throne still carried the legacy of Augustus, Nero, and Constantine, and like those emperors before her, Irene proved that the closer one sits to absolute power, the closer one stands to absolute corruption. Her victim was her own child, Constantine VI, the boy she had raised to be emperor. He was not an enemy general, not a rival senator, not a barbarian invader. He was her blood. And yet, when his presence threatened her grip on power, Irene chose a punishment reserved for palace slaves and conquered captives: castration. Why castration? In the Byzantine court, mutilation was a political weapon. According to chroniclers like Theophanes the Confessor, a man who was castrated could not rule because his body no longer represented the wholeness of Roman authority. Castration was not simply a physical act, it was symbolic annihilation. His crown, his armies, even his lineage meant nothing once his manhood was gone. And so, when whispers grew in Constantinople that Constantine would assert himself, rallying generals and bishops against his mother, Irene acted first. She staged a coup in the palace. Soldiers loyal to her seized him, dragged him from the imperial throne room, and carried him into a chamber where his fate was sealed. The chronicler Theophanes writes that Constantine was blinded and destroyed, a phrase that suggests castration was coupled with mutilation, a double assurance that no man would ever follow him, and no people would ever accept him as their emperor again. Witnesses reported that the boy screamed until his voice broke. And then there was silence. The palace guards emerged pale. Some swore they had seen the Virgin Mary's icons weeping in the candlelight. For Byzantium was an empire where faith and politics interwove. And here, the Empress had just committed a crime against both blood and heaven. His shield was shame, and with it, the Empress secured her power. But only for a time. The world Irene ruled was not the Rome of gladiators and senators, but the Rome of incense-filled churches and jewel-encrusted icons. Yet beneath the golden mosaics, the same ruthless logic of survival lingered. Power was absolute, and it was fragile. In the Byzantine court, survival was not measured by victories on the battlefield alone. It was measured in ritual humiliation, symbolic mutilation, and the calculated erasure of rivals. A simple exile might not be enough. A defeated enemy, if left intact, could return with an army or a faction of loyal nobles. But a mutilated rival? He was finished forever. The Byzantines had perfected this cruel science. According to chroniclers like John Skylitzes and Theophanes, the imperial palace in Constantinople held chambers not only for coronations and councils, but also for the ritual disfigurement of fallen emperors. Blinding in particular was common, because an emperor who could not see was unfit to rule. Castration went even further. It did not simply unman a man, it unthroned him symbolically. The historian Michael Sellos later observed that eunuchs, paradoxically, could rise to immense power within the court. They were safe in the eyes of the throne because they posed no dynastic threat. They could not found rival bloodlines. This made them perfect servants, ministers, and generals. Indeed, by the time of Irene, some of the empire's most influential figures were eunuchs, generals who led armies, patriarchs who guided the church, and chamberlains who controlled the flow of information to the throne. But the same logic that elevated eunuchs destroyed emperors. For a prince or emperor, castration was the ultimate disqualification. It was not just a personal shame. It was a public declaration that this man could never again embody the Roman ideal of strength, virility, and continuity. As Cassius Dio had written centuries earlier about Roman attitudes, What is broken in body is broken in spirit, and what is broken in spirit is unfit to rule. And so, when Irene faced the growing independence of her son Constantine VI, she turned to the very tools her culture had sanctified. Exile would not suffice. Her son might return. Prison would not suffice. His followers might free him. Death would not suffice. A martyr's blood could inspire rebellion. But castration? That erased him in the eyes of church, court, and people. He would be alive, but politically dead. Eyewitness framing. Imagine the palace guards, veterans of wars against Bulgars and Arabs, now reduced to escorting their young emperor to a chamber of mutilation. One chronicler suggests they hesitated, torn between loyalty to their sovereign and fear of their empress. But in Byzantine politics, hesitation was dangerous. Disobedience could lead to their own blinding or mutilation. And so they obeyed, because the empire had trained them to understand that a mutilated man was no longer a man and no longer their emperor. Broader cultural context. This was not unique to Byzantium. In earlier Rome, emperors had used humiliation and forced intimacy as instruments of power. Suetonius tells us that Caligula delighted in degrading senators before the court, while Domitian forced noble families into marriages designed to weaken their honor. The body was always political. In Byzantium, that logic had been codified. The act of mutilating a rival was not seen as sadism alone. It was seen as a ritual act of purification, ensuring that the imperial throne remained unsullied by claimants. Some theologians even justified it, arguing that God allowed such acts to preserve the rightful order of empire. For Irene, who styled herself as Basilius, not merely Empress, but Emperor of the Romans, this logic offered a shield. By unmaking her son's body, she unmade his claim, and she could cloak her brutality in the language of necessity. The empire must have one ruler, one throne, one body of authority. But if mutilation was politics, what did it do to the soul of the one who ordered it? For Irene, the act of castrating her son was not only a calculation of power, it was the reflection of a deeper obsession, a hunger that no crown could satisfy. She was not born in a palace. She was not the daughter of emperors or generals. Irene came from Athens, then a fading jewel of Greece under Byzantine rule. The city had philosophy, relics, and ruins, but it did not have power. By the standards of Constantinople, Irene was provincial, and yet she would rise higher than any woman of her age. How? Through marriage, and through cunning. At 16, Irene was chosen to marry Leo IV, son of the Emperor Constantine V. This was no ordinary match. Byzantine emperors scoured the provinces for women who were beautiful, noble, and above all politically useful. Irene's family offered connections, but more importantly, Irene herself possessed an ambition that was invisible at first glance. Chroniclers describe her as elegant, pious, and charming, but beneath the veil lay steel. When Leo IV ascended to the throne in 775, Irene became Augusta, the Empress. She bore him a son, Constantine VI, securing the dynasty. To all appearances, her role was complete. She was the mother of the heir, a figure meant to stand beside her husband quietly. But Irene was not content with shadows. She wanted light, and she wanted the throne itself. Leo IV's death. The window opens fate intervened when Leo IV fell gravely ill. Some sources suggest tuberculosis, others whisper poison. In 780, at the age of just 30, Leo died, leaving his 10-year-old son as emperor. A boy could not rule alone, and so Irene became regent, the ruler in all but name. At first, she cloaked her rule in maternal language. She was the guardian of the boy emperor, the protector of the dynasty. But soon, courtiers and bishops realized that Irene was not merely holding power until her son matured. She was building a regime of her own. Consolidation of power. Irene's first moves revealed her strategy. The Byzantine Empire was divided by the iconoclast controversy, a bitter struggle over whether holy icons should be venerated or destroyed. Irene, though officially neutral at first, began to side with the iconodules, those who supported the veneration of images. Why? Because this position gave her allies in the church, which could sanctify her power. She summoned councils, dismissed generals loyal to her late husband's policies, and promoted men who owed their positions to her. Many of them were eunuchs, loyal not to dynasties, but to Irene herself. Chroniclers remark that the corridors of the palace filled with these smooth-faced ministers, who whispered strategies into the Empress's ear and carried out her orders with zeal. But power breeds enemies. Noble families grumbled that a woman ruled in the emperor's place. Soldiers muttered that the army's victories were being overshadowed by palace intrigues. Even young Constantine VI, now growing into adolescence, began to sense that he was more puppet than emperor. The boy emperor's shadow, here lay Irene's dilemma. The stronger her son grew, the weaker her control became. He was the rightful emperor, and as he aged, generals, senators, and bishops began to rally to him. In public processions, cheers for Constantine were louder than for his mother. In whispered conversations, nobles spoke of the day when the boy would cast off his mother's regency and rule as a man. For Irene, that day was her nightmare. She had tasted power, and power, once tasted, is not easily surrendered. Some sources suggest that Irene initially tried to co-rule, allowing Constantine a share of authority. Coins were minted bearing both their faces, symbolizing joint rule, but soon it became clear Irene would not share. Behind closed doors, she schemed to keep her grip. The first coup attempt in 790, when Constantine VI was 20 years old, he attempted his first act of defiance. He rallied military factions loyal to him and tried to seize power from his mother. For a brief moment, he succeeded. Chroniclers note that Irene was confined to her palace chambers, while Constantine issued decrees as sole ruler. But the young emperor lacked his mother's cunning. He alienated allies, punished generals, and soon lost the support of key factions. Within a year, Irene regained her position, maneuvering her way back into power by exploiting his missteps. The image was clear. The boy might wear the crown, but the mother held the scepter. Psychological undercurrent at this stage. Irene's ambition hardened into something darker. To her, Constantine was no longer a son. He was a rival. Every gesture of independence from him was a threat to her throne, and every cheer he received from the people was a reminder of the power she might lose. According to Theophanes the Confessor, Irene's palace became a nest of conspiracies. She plotted in the shadow of icons, whispering with her eunuch advisors about how to neutralize her own child. The idea of mutilation, castration, blinding, destruction was not yet spoken aloud, but it hovered in the air. For in Byzantium, this was the language of succession. She had risen from Athens to Augusta, from widow to regent, from mother to ruler. But the higher Irene climbed, the more dangerous her own son became. And when he reached for the throne, she did not see a boy she had raised. She saw an enemy to be broken. The year was 797. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's 1,000-year legacy, had a boy on the throne and a woman who refused to let go of it. Constantine VI, now in his 20s, had tried twice to cast off his mother's control. Twice he had failed. And now Irene decided that failure was not enough. He must be erased. The plot unfolded in silence. The imperial palace was a labyrinth of marble halls, guarded gates and hidden chambers. Irene's loyal eunuchs, men, who owed their entire existence to her patronage, carried her orders like whispers of doom. These were not soldiers of the field, but soldiers of the court, chamberlains, scribes, and guards who had long learned that obedience was survival. According to Theophanes the Confessor, Irene summoned her son under the pretext of reconciliation. Constantine, weary of the palace wars, agreed. He entered the palace, perhaps believing his mother at last intended peace. But peace was not waiting for him. Soldiers seized him. His cries echoed down corridors that had once celebrated his birth as emperor. The chamber of unmaking. The chronicler records what happened next with words as cold as marble. Constantine was blinded, but many historians, reading between the lines, argue that blinding was not all. Castration, the ultimate disqualification from rule, may also have been inflicted. Why? Because Byzantine politics demanded certainty. A blinded man could, in theory, still father heirs who might claim the throne. But a castrated man, he was cut off, both from power and from posterity. Imagine the scene, a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, iron instruments laid out on a wooden table, the guards holding down the emperor's arms, the eunuchs standing by, their own altered bodies proof of the system's cruelty, and in the shadows, perhaps unseen, the presence of Irene herself, the mother who had given him life, now ordering his destruction. It was not just mutilation, it was ritual humiliation. Constantine was made a living warning. The crown belongs not to blood, not to lineage, but to the one ruthless enough to keep it. Eyewitness perspectives' accounts differ on how the act was remembered. Some say Constantine screamed until his voice broke and the palace walls seemed to tremble. Others claim that after the mutilation, his body was carried out and displayed briefly. A broken emperor shown to his people as if to say, "This man no longer rules." One legend whispered in Constantinople told of icons in the palace chapel, weeping blood as the act was carried out, a sign that heaven itself recoiled at the crime. Priests spoke cautiously, for Irene still commanded the church, but many later chroniclers called it an act that blackened her soul. The role of eunuchs. Here lies one of the darkest ironies. The very men who performed or supervised Constantine's mutilation were eunuchs themselves. Many had been castrated as boys, often slaves or prisoners taken from distant lands, altered to serve the empire. They had risen in power precisely because they were safe. And now they inflicted upon an emperor what had once been inflicted upon them. It was the empire consuming its own logic, eunuchs castrating the emperor to create more eunuchs of power. For Irene, it was perfect. For Constantine, it was annihilation. Aftermath in the palace. The young emperor was left mutilated, broken, and unable to rule. Some sources say he lingered for a time, his body weak, his spirit shattered. Others claim he died shortly after, either from the wounds or from neglect. Whatever the truth, Constantine vanished from the stage of history, erased not only from power, but from the memory his mother sought to control. Irene then proclaimed herself not Empress, but Basileus, Emperor of the Romans. She did not share the throne, did not rule as consort, did not even pretend to be regent. She took the full title, wielding it as if to say, "The empire belongs to me alone." Symbolic violence. Why did this act resonate so deeply? Because in Byzantine political culture, mutilation was more than physical punishment. It was symbolic violence, a message to the entire empire. By castrating her son, Irene declared that bloodlines could be broken, that motherhood meant nothing against ambition, and that Rome's throne was not sacred but subject to the knife. Theophanes writes with chilling brevity, "She laid hands upon her son and blinded him." That brevity is itself telling. Chroniclers could not linger over details without staining their own pens. And yet, in that single sentence, a millennium of Roman family values, patria potestas, filial duty, maternal care, collapsed into horror. Irene had won. The throne was hers. But in gaining everything, she had sown the seeds of her ruin. For no empire can be built forever on blood and silence. And the people of Constantinople would not forgive a mother who destroyed her son. History often records what happened. More rarely does it reveal why. With Irene, the act of mutilating her son has haunted historians for over a millennium. What could drive a mother to such extremes? Was it madness, cold calculation, or something darker? A love of power so consuming. It eclipsed blood itself. Irene's rise had been improbable. From a provincial girl in Athens, she had become ruler of the empire that called itself the heir of Rome. To hold that throne, even temporarily, was intoxicating. Chroniclers describe her ruling with regal confidence, her image stamped on coins, her name proclaimed in churches. Power once tasted is not easily surrendered. For Irene, the crown was no longer a trust to be passed on to her son. It was an identity. She was not simply regent, she was emperor. And like a lioness guarding a kill, She saw every hand reaching toward that throne, even her son's, as a rival to be torn away. The maternal paradox. This is what makes Irene's psychology so chilling. She was not only an empress, but a mother. In Roman and Christian tradition, motherhood was sacred, bound by duty to protect and nurture. Irene inverted that duty. To protect her throne, she destroyed her child. Ancient writers struggled to process this paradox. Theophanes condemned her as a second Jezebel, invoking the biblical queen who destroyed her family for power. Later, Byzantine chroniclers depicted her as a warning, a living parable of ambition turned monstrous. And yet, this piety lived alongside her cruelty. To her supporters, she was chosen by God to preserve orthodoxy. To her detractors, she was a hypocrite who kissed icons with lips that ordered mutilation. Did she believe God sanctioned her act? Possibly. In Byzantine ideology, the emperor ruled as God's vicegerent on earth. If Irene saw herself as the chosen protector of faith, then any threat to her reign, even her son, could be cast as a threat to divine order itself. By eliminating him, she preserved not only her throne, but the true faith. Psychological portrait modern historians have debated Irene's state of mind. Some see her as a cold pragmatist, using the tools of her culture, mutilation, blinding, castration, without hesitation. Others see hints of obsession, even madness, a woman so consumed by fear of losing power that she could no longer distinguish between mother and rival. One can imagine her walking the marble halls of the palace, icons glittering in the lamplight, whispering prayers even as she plotted mutilation. A figure torn between faith and ambition, humanity and monstrosity. Her eunuch advisors reinforced this mindset. They had no dynasties of their own. Their fate was tied to hers. To them, Constantine was a danger, a living threat who might strip them of their offices. And so they encouraged Irene's darkest thoughts, feeding her paranoia. "Your son will betray you," they might whisper. "Only by breaking him can you preserve what you have built." Historical parallels. Rome had seen monstrous mothers before. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, was accused of ruling through her son's reign, until he murdered her. But Irene inverted the pattern. Instead of the son killing the mother destroyed the son. It was the Roman family, the domus, turned inside out. In doing so, Irene crossed a line that even Rome's most infamous rulers rarely dared. For while emperors humiliated and executed rivals, the bond of blood, especially between mother and child, was rarely violated so directly. Irene shattered that taboo, and in doing so, carved her name into history's darker pages. But if Irene believed mutilating her son secured her throne, she was mistaken. The empire she ruled was not blind. Her crime had consequences. For the court, for the church, for the very heart of Constantinople, and those consequences would come to claim her. The knives had done their work. Constantine VI was broken, and Irene sat on the throne as Basilius, not merely an empress, but emperor of the Romans. Yet power gained through blood is never secure. The echoes of her act reverberated through every chamber of Constantinople, through the cathedrals and marketplaces, even across the borders of the empire. The court whispers in the marble halls. The palace was the first to feel the tremors. Courtiers, who had once pledged loyalty to Constantine VI, now bowed to Irene, but their knees bent in fear, not devotion. Every whisper in the marble halls was dangerous. If a mother could order the mutilation of her son, what protection did rank or title offer? Eunuchs, the architects of her coup, now dominated the corridors. They were rewarded with titles and lands, their presence a constant reminder of the price of disobedience. Some nobles, resentful of Irene's reliance on castrated advisors, called her court a kingdom of eunuchs. But none dared speak too loudly, for Irene's gaze was sharper than the knife. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Families of Constantine's supporters whispered of vengeance. Some chroniclers suggest that even the guards who carried out the act felt cursed, haunted by dreams of the young emperor's cries. The army. Loyalty broken. The Byzantine army was less subtle. Soldiers were the backbone of imperial authority, and many had sworn loyalty to Constantine VI. They had marched under his banners, fought the Bulgars in his name. To learn that their emperor had been blinded, perhaps castrated, at the command of his mother, was a humiliation beyond words. In campfires along the empire's borders, soldiers spat curses against Irene. Some deserted, others plotted rebellion. Chroniclers record that generals grew restless, questioning whether a woman, especially one stained by such scandal, could command their loyalty. The military's distrust weakened Irene's position. Byzantium, always surrounded by enemies, Arabs to the east, Bulgars to the north, Franks to the west, needed unity. But Irene's act had fractured that unity. A blinded sun meant a broken chain of command, and soldiers who once fought for Rome now doubted whether Rome itself was worth dying for. The Church, heaven's judgment. The Church was caught in a bind. On the one hand, Irene was the savior of icons. She had restored their veneration, ending decades of bitter conflict. Monks and priests hailed her as a defender of orthodoxy. The Second Council of Nicaea, convened under her authority in 787, had been a triumph of faith. But on the other hand, her crime against her son was too monstrous to ignore. Christian teaching exalted the bond of mother and child as sacred. To destroy that bond was to defy God's order. Some priests denounced her, calling her a Jezebel, a murderer in spirit, if not in open act. Legends spread of icons weeping, of saints turning their faces away from the palace. The faithful whispered that Constantinople itself was cursed, that the city's fortunes would decline under a mother who mutilated her son. The patriarchs, cautious of Irene's power, did not openly condemn her, but the silence of heaven was loud. Every sermon about betrayal, every hymn about the cruelty of Herod or Jezebel, became a shadowed reference to the Empress. The people, fear and rumour. Among the people of Constantinople, rumour grew like ivy. The markets buzzed with questions. Did Constantine still live? Was he hidden in the palace, blinded and broken? Or had he died under the knife, his body buried in secret? Some claimed to have seen him stumbling through corridors, led by servants. Others swore that a ghost wandered the palace walls, crying for justice. Whether true or not, these stories fed a growing unease, for the Roman people knew that an empire ruled by terror could not endure. Irene tried to counter this unease with spectacle. She staged processions, appearing in golden robes, her image haloed by the sun's reflection off the mosaics. Coins bore her face alone, radiating imperial majesty. But even in the cheers of the crowd, there was an undertone of fear, applause given because silence might be punished. Foreign powers. A throne without heirs beyond Byzantium's walls, foreign rulers watched with interest. Charlemagne in the west, crowned king of the Franks, saw an opportunity. If the Byzantine throne had been usurped by a woman who destroyed her heir, perhaps the Roman imperial title itself was vacant. In 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in Rome, a direct challenge to Byzantium's claim. Irene's crime had weakened her legitimacy, and foreign powers exploited the void. The Empire of the West was reborn because the Empire of the East had mutilated its future. Arabs and Bulgars too tested Byzantium's borders, emboldened by rumors of weakness. For enemies knew, an empire divided against itself was ripe for attack. The invisible wound. The consequences of Irene's act were not only political, they were psychological. An empire is not built on stone alone, but on belief. Belief that its ruler is chosen, sacred, worthy. Irene shattered that belief. By breaking her son, she broke the illusion that the imperial throne was untouchable. In the words of one Byzantine chronicler, she reigned, but the empire did not rejoice. She conquered, but she conquered herself. Irene had silenced her son, but she could not silence the empire. And the same palace that once echoed with Constantine's cries would soon echo with the footsteps of conspirators who had waited for their chance to strike. For a moment, Irene stood as absolute ruler of the Byzantine Empire. She had silenced her son, crushed rivals, and adorned herself with the title of Basileus, Emperor of the Romans. But power bought with blood carries its own curse. The same cruelty that secured her throne ensured that no one trusted her enough to keep her there. The first cracks. The palace she ruled was heavy with silence, but silence is brittle. Eunuchs who had been her closest allies began to whisper among themselves. They owed their rise to her, yes, but they also feared her. If she could mutilate her son, what mercy could they expect if they displeased her? Nobles too grew restless. Families who had supported Constantine VI never forgave his fate. Some plotted revenge, others waited for a chance to back a new emperor. Irene's reign, though outwardly glittering with golden processions and jeweled robes, was inwardly rotting. The army's discontent Byzantium soldiers, still humiliated by her betrayal of Constantine, resisted Irene's commands. Campaigns against Bulgars faltered. Rumors spread that generals ignored her orders, fighting half-heartedly or deserting outright. The image of Irene as a divinely chosen ruler crumbled in the dust of failed wars. A soldier's loyalty is forged in the belief that his commander fights for him, that the emperor is the embodiment of Rome. Irene, in their eyes, was neither mother nor emperor, but a usurper whose rule was written in her son's. Chroniclers in Constantinople recorded the shock. For centuries, the Byzantines had seen themselves as the true Rome, heirs of Augustus and Constantine. Now a Frankish king wore the crown, and all Europe recognized him. Irene had not only destroyed her heir, she had shattered her empire's prestige. Some whispered that Irene considered marrying Charlemagne to unite East and West under her rule. If true, it reveals both her ambition and her desperation. But the plan, if it ever existed, collapsed under scandal. The idea of their empress marrying a barbarian king horrified Constantinople's elite. Irene's enemies seized the moment to tighten the noose. The conspiracy forms by 802, conspirators gathered in secret. They included eunuchs once loyal to Irene, generals angry at her weakness, and courtiers tired of her tyranny. Their plan was simple: remove Irene and place Nikephoros, her trusted finance minister, on the throne. The coup unfolded with quiet precision. While Irene prepared for another day of ceremonies, soldiers loyal to the conspirators surrounded the palace. Doors were sealed, chambers secured. When dawn broke over Constantinople, the empress was no longer ruler. Chroniclers say Irene was taken by surprise. She had trusted Nikephoros, even promoted him. Now he betrayed her, stepping into the throne she had mutilated her son to keep. Exile and silence. Irene was exiled to the island of Lesbos, far from the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia, far from the jeweled throne she had guarded so jealously. There, stripped of power, she lived in obscurity. Some sources say she was forced to weave wool with her own hands, a cruel echo of her fall from emperor to exile, from silk and gold to thread and spindle. Within a year, she was dead. No grand funeral, no imperial honors, just silence. The woman who had ruled as emperor, who had ordered her son's mutilation, who had held the fate of Rome in her hands, died as a forgotten exile on a lonely island. Historical judgment. How did history remember her? For some, Irene was a villain, a mother who destroyed her child, a ruler whose ambition devoured her family and her empire. For others, she was a paradox, pious and cruel, saintly and monstrous, the restorer of icons and the destroyer of her son. Chroniclers, like Theophanes, painted her in shadows, condemning her as a Jezebel, a warning to future rulers. Yet even her enemies admitted her intelligence, her cunning, her ability to rule in a world that rarely allowed women to sit on thrones. But Irene's story did not vanish with her. Her crime became legend, whispered through centuries as a cautionary tale. And when later emperors looked to their heirs, they remembered the Empress who mutilated her own son. And they trembled. When the island winds swept over Irene's lonely grave, her empire did not mourn. And yet, the story of the Empress who mutilated her own son did not die with her. It became a stain upon the memory of Byzantium, an echo that reached through centuries. The legacy in Byzantium future emperors remembered Irene's crime with dread. To blind or castrate a rival was one thing. It was standard practice in the brutal logic of Byzantine politics. But to destroy one's own heir, one's own child, was an act that lingered in collective memory like a curse. Chroniclers never let it rest. Theophanes recorded her cruelty in trembling words. Later, historians like Zonaras and Skylitzes repeated the tale, often with embellishment, using it as a warning about unchecked ambition. For centuries, Irene's name was invoked as shorthand for tyranny hidden behind piety. Even her great triumph, restoring the veneration of icons, was overshadowed. Monks remembered her with gratitude for defending the faith, but always with the uneasy knowledge that the same woman who honored holy images had destroyed her living son. In sermons and chronicles alike, she became a paradox, both saintly and monstrous. Western judgment in the West, her legacy was even harsher. To the papacy and the Franks, Irene's scandal justified crowning Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. They argued that Byzantium's throne had been defiled, its legitimacy destroyed by a mother's crime. Thus, Irene's act did not merely haunt her memory. It altered the map of Europe. From her mutilation of Constantine VI sprang the split between Eastern and Western empires, a division that shaped the continent for centuries. The mother's curse. The deeper legacy, however, was psychological. Irene's story became a cautionary tale not just about empire, but about family. In the ancient world, the Roman household, the domus, was the bedrock of society. The emperor was meant to embody the father of the nation, the mother, its guardian. Irene shattered that ideal. She proved that ambition could cut deeper than blood. For later generations, her name symbolized the collapse of natural bonds under the weight of power. Chroniclers described her as inhuman, against nature, a second Jezebel. And yet, in condemning her, they revealed their own fear, that power itself has no loyalty, not even to family. Modern reflection. Power in the family. What makes Irene's story endure is not just its brutality, but its familiarity. Strip away the marble palaces and jeweled crowns, and her tale is the story of ambition overriding duty. How many rulers, ancient or modern, have sacrificed their families, their allies, even their humanity to hold power just a little longer? Her act forces a question as old as politics itself. When power is at stake, what is sacred? For Irene, not even her son's body was sacred. His blood was ink, and she used it to write her claim to the throne. The universal warning, that is why her story matters still, because Irene reminds us that ambition, unchecked, can turn the most natural bond, a mother and her child, into a battlefield. She reminds us that symbols, like crowns and icons, can be twisted to excuse cruelty. And she reminds us that power, once tasted, demands ever greater sacrifices until nothing is left but silence. In the words of one Byzantine monk, written a century after her death, she sat upon the throne of Constantine, but she could not sit upon her conscience, for the throne was high, but the soul was low. When we walk through history's ruins, we often admire the mosaics, the domes, the battles won and lost. But the true scars of empire are not carved in stone. They are carved in the lives shattered by ambition. Irene's son was blinded, mutilated, perhaps castrated, but in truth, it was the empire itself that was mutilated by her act. Today, when we look at leaders who cling to power at any cost, who betray family, allies, or people, we see Irene's shadow. Her story is not just Byzantine, it is universal. If this story of ambition, betrayal, and cruelty has gripped you, remember, history is full of such scandals, hidden tales that textbooks dare not tell. Subscribe to this channel for more forbidden histories. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and tell me, what do you think is worse? A son killing his mother, or a mother destroying her son? Because Irene's story forces us to confront a truth darker than any throne room. Sometimes the greatest danger is not the enemy outside the gates, but the hand that rocks the cradle.